Okay, well, good to see everybody here. We know some folks are still on the way.
This is so low. Here's my cup. Oh, thank you.
Thanks for
Pretty and red.
Thank you.
welcome those who are tuning in online. Here we are in our family room again, having our little service. So,
She doesn't recognize Elsa?
really?
Yeah. She's going after her.
Yeah.
Because I gave her my
Checking
cup.
around. Yeah, checking around. Says, I knew somebody else is supposed to come.
She
and I
didn't
can
get a
bark
chance to talk to you today, did she?
Yeah.
When you
Maybe it's
came
the
in.
hair.
I think a dog would know
Is
the
it my
difference.
hair?
Go get it.
She says, "Oh, let me come love you, and I'll be fine."
Careful on her left side. She has like something she rolled in. Just right, yeah, just that one spot.
Anyway, let's pause a sec and let's bow our heads for prayer.
It's praise.
Okay. Father in heaven, we come to you in Jesus' wonderful name, thanking you and praising you for all the many blessings that have come our way this week. It has been a very busy couple of weeks for us as we're moving, but you've supplied the strength and the purpose to get us through and the endurance, and we want to thank you for that. Others have had busy times as well. I'm just thankful, Lord, for you taking such good care of us. We want there are lots of folks on our prayer list that we've been praying for, various things. And we're asking and trusting, Lord, that you take care of all of their needs, and we just leave them in your capable hands. I want to thank you for all those that tune in online and watch. Several states and a couple of countries. We're just thankful, Lord, that your message is going out and that we can reach people that may not normally attend a church. We're just asking that you would be with us as we open your book, and that you would help us as we study your word, that it might find a lodging place in our hearts and minds and might transform them to be ready for your soon return. Thank you for all these wonderful things, because we ask them all in Jesus' wonderful name and for his sake alone. Amen and amen.
Stop.
You timed that just right, dear. Ray and Mary say Happy Sabbath.
Happy Sabbath.
Shalom.
Roy and Mary, I'm sorry.
Shalom.
My sad little eyes here.
That little
Behave
eyes, yeah,
yourself.
well, shalom.
Behave yourself.
Just getting started here, and of course it's a very laid-back service that we do here. And we also invite others if you're at a place where the regular church scene is not working for you. And we just pray that you can be inspired to do this kind of thing in your own neighborhood.
Hey, Brian.
What happens when a min pin meets a shih tzu?
Are we bringing her in?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, they're afraid she's gonna bark at Daisy.
Oh, she'll bark at anything.
Yeah,
Well, do we need
She
to put her
barks
like
at
in the back
everyone.
room or something? We can put her in the back bedroom.
We can put her in the back bedroom. How are you? Good morning.
It's a lovely dress.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Got a nice crowd this morning.
Happy Sabbath.
Yes.
No, you happy Sabbath.
Reminds me of the high priest.
High priestess.
Oh, yeah.
Her coat of many colors.
Yeah, Joseph's coat. So, what's up, dude?
I want to have Joseph's coat.
You doing alright? Good deal, man.
Where's Carlos?
He's putting Macy
And the
outside.
yeah.
Carried the duel.
Então a Macy hoje eu lembro uma lembrança da menina ali, eu já tava caminhando esse bicho.
Did he need to put her somewhere, or just?
I think he's just walking her around for a little bit.
No, he put Macy.
She's on the porch. She's on the screen porch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isabel can go bark at her through the glass.
No, we're not gonna have that
He
either.
forgot about it.
We're not gonna have that.
That's
either.
okay. She won't go over there, so.
She'll just come over to greet him.
Yeah.
Here it comes. Wait for it. Wait for it.
Isabel.
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 It's the Sabbath attack dog.
Yeah.
Come here, Isabel.
Find the
Our
non-Sabbath
greeter.
keeper.
Our greeter wakes you right up.
Our
when you come
doorbell is fully charged.
Yeah.
in. Go and lay down.
Isabel.
Hey, go on over there and lay down. All right, you've done your job. Thank you.
Good girl.
Thank you. You've done everything nice.
Got a nice group this morning, filling up all her seats.
Yeah. Okay.
You got Isabel, right?
Women should wear a modest head covering.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mother Mary.
Yeah. Right.
With the blue hood like she's always depicted.
any rate, we're continuing our story, and I don't know what chapter we're in, but
We're in the middle of the one we were
we're
last
talking
time.
about spiritual warfare here. And
We didn't finish it.
this is Peretti's book, for those of you that are following along with us out there. And it gets a little dry at times, but hopefully you get the gist of really what's happening here.
Okay. Yeah, this was where the newspaper editor-owner was talking to the former president of the college.
Right.
And he said, and what about Ted Harmel? Now, you remember Ted Harmel was the one who had been the editor of the newspaper before him. Strachan tightened his lips, looked at the floor, and sighed. Yes, he did try to back out. But by then they'd already entrusted too much information to him. When they found they couldn't control him anymore, he has myself and our friendship to blame for that, they arranged to defame him and chase him out of town with that ridiculous scandal. Said Bernice, a conflict of interest. Well, of course. He kept telling me it was a fascinating new science of the human mind, and he claimed he was only after a story, but he just kept getting more and more wrapped up in it, and they wooed him, I'm sure. I heard him say they had promised him great success with his newspaper because he had aligned himself with them. Marshall had another flashback. He saw Alf Brummel looking at him with those numbing gray eyes, saying sweetly, Marshall, we'd like to know that you'll be standing with us. Strachan was still talking, and Marshall woke up and said, excuse me, what was that again? Strachan said, I was just saying that Ted became torn between two loyalties. First and foremost, he was loyal to the truth and to his friends, and that included me. His other loyalty was to the Langstratt Group and their philosophies and practices. I guess he thought that the truth was inviolable and the press would always be free. But whatever the reason, he began to print stories about the financial problems, and that was definitely stepping over the line as far as the Regents were concerned. Bernice said, now I remember him saying they were trying to control him and dictate what he printed. He was really mad about it. Well, of course, said Strachan, when it came down to principles, regardless of what so-called science or metaphysical philosophies he may have been interested in, Ted was still a newspaper man, and he would not be intimidated. So I'm afraid he got caught in the crossfire of my battle with the college regents. Consequently, we both lost our positions, our good standing in the community, everything, I guess you could say. I was well content to leave it all behind. It was just impossible to fight it. Marshall disliked that kind of talk. Are they, or is this thing really that strong? Strachan was deadly serious. I don't think I ever realized how vast and strong it really was, and I guess I'm still finding out. Mr. Hogan, I have no idea what the final goal of these people is, but I'm beginning to see that nothing standing in their way can escape being stamped out or eliminated. Even as we sit here, I can look back over the years, and not even considering our faculty turnover, I'm frightened to think of how many other people around Ashton have just dropped out of sight. Joe, the supermarket owner, Marshall thought. What about Edie? Strachan was looking a little pale now, and asked with obvious worry in his voice, just what do you people intend to do with this information? Marshall had to be honest. I don't know yet. There are too many missing pieces, too many assumptions, and I don't have anything I can print. You do remember what happened to Ted. You're keeping that in mind? All right, my mouse has suddenly stopped working here. Marshall didn't want to think about that. He wanted to find out something else. Ted wouldn't even talk to me. Well, he's scared. Of what? Of them, the system that destroyed him. He knows more about their weird goings-on than I do. He knows enough to be a lot more afraid than I am, and I believe his fears are justified. I do believe there's a genuine danger here. Well, does he ever talk to you? Sure, but about anything else besides what you're after. But the two of you are in touch? Yes, we fish and hunt. We meet for lunch. He isn't far from here. Could you call him? You mean call him and put in a plug for you? Well, that's exactly what I mean. Well, he may not want to talk, and I can't push him. But would you just call him and see if he'll talk to me one more time? Well, I'll think about it, but that's all I can promise you. I'd appreciate even that, Marshall said. But, Mr. Hogan, Strachan reached over and grabbed Marshall's arm, and he looked at both Marshall and Bernice very quietly. You people watch out for yourselves. You're not invincible, None of the rest were, and I believe it's possible to lose everything if you make one wrong move or take just one wrong step. Please be sure at every moment that you know exactly what you're doing.
You know, as we listen to all the interaction between the various characters there, we know that the enemy's ultimate gain is to gain control of towns, cities, countries, the world, right? As a Christian, you know the end of the story, you know, so what's the big deal? I mean, we all know the Bible tells us that Satan ultimately was defeated at Calvary, and that eventually he will be destroyed along with all the rest of the wicked. So what's the big deal of him? You know, why is he trying so hard to take control of you know, the town council and the church on the corner, and you know, just a question. Why is he trying so hard to do that?
Because he thinks he has a shot at still preserving his life.
Oh yeah, how so?
He thinks if he can get all of the wicked on his side and destroy all of the righteous, then he can tell God that this planet is his, and he can just take his righteous and go home.
I mean, what you're describing as you read through this, and I know it's just a fictional representation, but you're talking about some almost a desperation that's going on there, just incredible effort being displayed by the enemy to take control of folks. And what's the real danger in having control of, you know, the town council and the school board and the local governments and whatnot? What's the real danger?
Having control of the population.
Controlling society, yeah.
Controlling children, controlling parents,
Yeah, the
controlling
school system,
the police.
just, you know. I mean, what he's trying to do really is destroy the Christian influence in society.
I was just thinking it makes total sense too because of his character, for Satan at least. Because I was wondering, like, you know, he should be wise enough to realize he's already lost, but it also talks about his first sin being pride, and being so prideful he wouldn't admit defeat. So it's like, makes total sense too to think about it that way. That's
Right. Well, what your mom was alluding to is something that we've always talked about, and that is how relevant are the remnant. You know, the Bible talks about a remnant in the book of Revelation, and how relevant they are, because really the great controversy is, well, humanity's kind of caught in the middle of this supernatural warfare, but the real issue at stake is the character of God, right? I mean, throughout
Displaying his character.
creation, the character of God is really what's on trial. And so that's really the issue. That character is vindicated at the darkest hour of Earth's history by the remnant. Okay, that is so important, so critical, that and he knows it, and that's why he's working so hard to try to thwart that.
Dan and Susan say, having been as close to God as he was, he knows how much the heart of God is grieved when one is lost.
Yeah.
So he'll make every effort to destroy every possible life he can.
Yeah, that's the other thing. He's like they're saying, you know, which is a great point. You know, he's been there in heaven. He's been at the throne. He's been in the. He's breathed the atmosphere of heaven. He realizes what he's lost, and he doesn't want anybody else to experience it either. So that's just the vindictiveness of him. But also, I think he believes that if he gains control of every living soul on the planet, God doesn't need to come back here to resurrect dust out of the ground, right? And so I think he thinks there's a play at the end where he can reclaim this, because there's nobody loyal to the Creator, nobody loyal to God. So he can basically say, if you come here, you're forcing your way, and that's not God's way, is
Well,
it?
Jesus referred to him as the prince of this world.
Yeah, right.
He has claimed the ownership of the earth by virtue of overcoming Adam and
Right.
Eve.
So his last play really is to just gain total control of humanity. And, you know, if you got one eye open on the news, just the news, you can see how everything is being just structured in such a way so that that will be totally possible. Politically, financially, you know, militarily, you know, energy-wise, you know, agricultural-wise. I mean, these are the 7 areas that if you have control of all 7 of those areas, then you have control of humanity.
Well, we have to understand the perspective that we're looking at this world plunging into greater darkness than it's ever been in before.
Right.
That's the
You
scene
can see it
ahead of
headed
us.
that way.
And to look at that, you may look at this and think, wow, he's really got this planet sewn up. But at the same time, that's one of the things I liked about this book, is that it emphasizes that the darkness isn't so deep because the light of God's people is here. And the more we pray, the greater light will be shining.
Right, and it's because of this, maybe this little old lady over in the corner that's praying.
Right.
Yes, and we think.
We think she's
we're-
insignificant.
Yeah, insignificant, and this little person over here just praying quietly in the corner.
But see, she's not the only one,
Yeah.
and that's the key that his book brings out, is that we underestimate what an influence we can have on world conditions by virtue of our praying, by our standing up against the darkness that's out here. You know, these are things that we as Christians, to sit back and say, oh, well, this is just the last days, let's get it over with and let it get as dark as it needs to, or whatever. We need to be warning as many people as we can, number one, and because more people means more praying.
And the whole book of Job is kind of an illustration of that, in a sense.
True.
All that playing out. Anyway, it's time for us to go through our study and
Susan says it's always darkest just before dawn.
the dawn. Yeah. The stars shine the brightest just at that time. So E, go ahead and take us in the direction you want us to go. We're going to follow up from last week.
Yeah. Yeah,
Our barefoot preacher today.
Yes. Yeah,
Most of us are barefoot.
Yeah. Yeah. Last week we kind of finished up talking from
Corinthians.
Proverbs 31
Yeah, 31, right?
and talking about the godly woman, virtuous woman, and so kind of just traveling more along those lines now. Figured we talk about children. You know.
There's also First Titus. And Titus talks about women,
Oh, we can go there too.
which I think is an important.
Yeah, because we
Yes,
had a
I think
bunch of passages.
Titus is an important arena. You just put that on your back burner. I think
Sure, we
that's-
can do Titus. Which Titus, just Titus 2.
I am no good at remembering the address.
got it
I'm only
written
good
down
at remembering
because
the
I had
face, the verse.
The face. If I saw Titus's face, I'd know exactly.
Like I'm
what he
saying,
was
I remember this was in Titus, but
Yeah.
and it's not a very big book, so it's not like we have a lot of
It's 3
things.
chapters.
Yeah, I think it was Titus 2 maybe.
But he does talk about
1, 4,
men
2,
when he
5.
talks
Or
about
maybe
the
just
bishop
one,
and
probably
leadership of the
just one.
church.
It was written down in one of my previous studies, and we just never got to it. But it was extra scripture we could talk
Right
about.
after Timothy, 2 Timothy.
Titus 1 probably.
It's in Titus 2, is where these verses are.
Which is a short chapter.
Short, yeah. But I think it's really good counsel, and especially in the age we're living in right now, where
Titus
all the
chapter
roles have been blurred. Titus 2, chapter 2.
Okay.
Titus.
It's out of
It was the book of 2nd Titus.
I was
That's
saying,
it, isn't it?
my brain was saying Titus 2, and I said 2nd Titus. I'm at least close.
That's why I was like, 2nd Titus.
It sounds like a disease.
2nd Titus.
Contracted 2nd Titus. Alright, so, alright, Titus chapter 2. Do we know which verses we're looking at?
It's a very short chapter. You can just read the whole thing.
Okay, well, we'll read and discuss then. We'll go on there. So this is Titus 2. Alright.
It may be 4. Chapter
what?
2, 4.
Well,
Yeah,
we'll
it's
get
4.
there.
It's
We'll
4.
get there. We'll read. Do we want to read the whole thing and then go back and discuss, or should we read part of it and discuss?
It's not a very long section, is it?
No.
You just read through the 15 verses and then go back
Okay.
and bring them through.
Alrighty. In that case, I'll read the first 5, and then Sim, you want to read the next 5?
Sure, I'm
Dad, you
reading.
can read the final 5.
Is it 15 verses then? Oh, yeah, that's fine.
That's fine. Alright.
Are you reading 2-5?
I'll read
I
through
guess I'm
5,
reading
and then
6
you'll
to-
read
I'm reading-
6 to 10.
Gotcha.
And then Dad will read 11 to 15. That confuses me sometimes too. I'm like, wait.
Which one of those on first?
Yeah. Alrighty. But speak thou the things which become sound doctrine, that the aged men be sober, grave, temperate, sound in faith, in charity, in patience. The aged women likewise, that they be in behavior as becometh holiness, not false accusers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things, that they may teach the young women to be sober, to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, keepers at home, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God be not blasphemed.
Young men likewise exhort to be sober-minded, in all things showing thyself a pattern of good works, in doctrine showing uncorruptness, gravity, and sincerity. Sound speech that cannot be condemned, that he that is of the contrary part may be ashamed, having no evil thing to say of you. Exhort servants to be obedient unto their own masters, and to please them will in all things, not answering again, not purloining,
Yeah,
Purloining?
that's a complicated.
That's an old word.
purloining, but showing all good fidelity,
Mine says pilfering.
that they may adorn the doctrine of God our Savior in all things.
And then the last part here says, for the grace of God that bringeth salvation has appeared to all men, teaching us that, denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in the present age, looking for the blessed hope and glorious appearing of our great God and Savior Jesus Christ, who gave himself for us, that he might redeem us from every lawless deed, purify for himself his own special people, zealous of good works. Paul says, speak these things, exhort and rebuke with all authority, let no one despise you. That's the end of chapter 2.
What does purloining mean? Purloining is that's a pilfering.
Okay.
Where you-
what was that?
Okay, if you were a servant, pilfering would be taking little things that don't belong to you.
Uh-huh.
It's a petty theft.
Okay, so like skimming off the top. That's
Yes.
the easy way of saying it.
Or helping yourself to some of your master's possessions if you're a
Okay.
servant.
Yeah, right.
So it's just like a shortened way of saying skimming off the top.
Just taking an extra cookie out of the cookie jar.
And some would say
Taking half
that
of the
applies
empty,
equally
yeah.
to employees.
Yeah.
Right.
Because you used to have a T-shirt they'd sell that said "They can't fire
Only
us;
the
slaves
people."
have to be sold." That being an employee is its own type of servanthood, and that these verses can apply to employees.
Yeah, so that's second Titus.
Master.
Call me master, boy.
I don't think they would have been
No
too far off.
purloining here.
Sometimes the old English is funny.
So looking at the characteristics of women there, speaking from verse 3. Looks like it's specifically discussing characteristics of aged women. So
It's a
What's an
it's
example
a
of
type
aged
of
women?
order within the church that the older women mentor the younger ones. That they become a community. You know, when in those days people lived in communities where everybody lived and worked and shopped in the same small little geographic area, the same town. They rarely left the town they lived in unless they went to a feast, you know, in Jerusalem or something. Most people didn't travel like we do today. So the families all grew up in that same community. But this is like creating an even tighter community within that group of church members, so that the older women can teach the younger women what kind of women they ought to be. And I think we lose that so in most modern churches. We don't have a lot of that. They'll have classes for the older women go to do their things, and the younger women do their things, and we don't have a lot of mingling in the big churches that I've been in.
They also address like gossip right away
Yes,
for
they
women,
do.
like right away. They're like, don't accuse people. Or don't false accuse.
And when you live in the South, that's a hard place to be because it's a time-honored Southern tradition.
Well, I think of it more in the aspect also of like the church itself. I've always met people, especially like older women in the church, who talk something about someone else, like in the gossip manner in a church, and I've always seen that.
Yeah.
Especially growing up, I've always seen a lot of women like talking with other women, be like, have you heard this about whatever?
Women like to discuss news.
Yeah.
Get those words out.
Yeah.
I think it's more than just the
But like, you called it a tradition, but obviously it's something that it's just perpetuated from person to person.
there's a huge
from
difference
generation to
between
generation.
talking about what's happening and ascribing people's motivations to it.
Yeah.
I mean, if you can talk about, so and so had their families had a round of croup or something like that. The kids have all been sick. Well, that kind of thing is not gossip. You're talking about something that's happening, and as godly women, then the natural response would be, what can we do to help?
Yeah.
But gossip is done just with the idle thing of, let's talk about them. Let's talk about what they're doing, what
Well,
they
yeah,
said.
like have you heard such and such as a drinking problem or...
Yeah. It's just a whole different motivation. Gossip is done primarily just to show I know something you don't know. It's
Right,
a
so
one-upmanship.
it's a one-up on
It
somebody.
is, and it's an evil thing because there's no good reason for it, just other than to spread news or spread tales about people. And a lot of times they're not true.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the definition of gossip is unfounded rumors, basically.
Yeah.
Saying something that you have not confirmed. I mean, it's not necessarily like you said. It's not a matter of speaking truth. It's a matter of, like they're saying, falsehood, false accusers. And I think that's important to address as well. And I like the aspect as well that it does promote the idea of mentorship and within the community of believers.
It says teachers of good things.
Yeah.
I wonder in this generation where we're so fragmented and don't really even see each other that often from week to week, how do we incorporate this into our lives? The biggest problem we have is that we've lost the sense of community. We no longer live and work and shop and interact with each other in the same region. Some people go clear to Christiansburg to go shopping. Some people go to Roanoke to go shopping. You don't cross paths with everybody in this area. At one time you would. Everybody went to the same marketplace and they all saw each other. And there was this camaraderie of doing things together. The older women helped the younger women look after their kids, and the kids felt like they were part of a big extended family. We have lost so much of that. I don't know if we can recreate that as a church group or not,
but now we
I
got
think it's a goal.
Facebook and Twitter.
I also feel like it relates to stuff like how kind of like a Sunday school, you have like all the like little kids inside there. It could even be like older women teaching younger girls, basically, young girls.
So what about Facebook and Twitter and those social media sites?
Like,
I mean, is it improving the sense of community, or is that just providing a platform for more efficient gossiping?
So far, it's the latter.
It's called a community.
I feel like it's hindered community more.
I think it's
it's
like
made it
anything
worse.
else. I think it's anything, you can use it to develop a sense of community, but on its surface, if you just leave it superficial, I think it destroys.
I mean, you're talking about communication.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what builds communities, communication.
Well, yeah, but the thing is that people get comfortable texting, and I barely know anyone who's comfortable just talking to people now. Like people who are just comfortable to walk up to somebody random and start a conversation, like that's very unheard of today. Just to be comfortable to walk up to somebody on the street and start talking.
And yet I talk to people all the time. I tell total
Yeah.
strangers in the store. People tell me their life story in the grocery store.
But like that's the thing. People who text me, like try to talk to me for hours or will talk to me for hours, and it's like they probably won't do that in person because texting is much easier and there's no risk of, I guess, being embarrassed or whatever. But like Facebook has made it a lot harder for people to actually be communal. I think that just comes with texting in general and just messaging.
I think a lot of that comes back to the destruction of the family model overall.
That too.
You know, the fact that the parents aren't leading their kids anymore, and they're not showing them what normal human interaction looks like. Oftentimes they're bad at it too.
Well, that's very true because, you know, a child growing up, if they don't have a lot of adult interaction, they learn their social behavior from their peers, which is always the worst possible model that you can do with kids. You know, that was one thing I learned within the homeschool movement was that the kids who were homeschooled, they got so much time with adults that they developed a more mature attitude, and when they were around their peers, they were head and shoulders above their peers because they weren't sitting there talking nonsense. They had some genuine purpose, and the kids would come back and say, you know, we went to this group and there were a bunch of these high school kids there or whatever. What a bunch of idiots! You know, they were, you know, rowdy and misbehaving, and you know, they weren't. Our kids weren't even interested in doing those kind of things because it just seemed silly and childish. And yet the kids their own age, that's the way they were behaving.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I think a lot of that just comes back to that idea. But I think it would be a benefit if that was a model that we picked back up.
The intruder alert.
Isabel.
You may want to take her over to the other side, let her loose in the house.
It's interesting too that they're also
Oh, come on.
Put her back in the back bedroom.
Huh? I'll just put her over on the other side, I guess.
Yeah, just put her inside over there. Over there.
She'll be better off doing when she can run back and forth up there. She can go barking, it won't disturb anybody.
But what's interesting as well is that this woman that we work for, every time me and Elijah are talking to her, she's always like, "Oh, you guys are so smart." No, Marie.
oh yeah.
And we're just like having normal conversations with her, and she thinks we're really smart kids.
Common sense
That's
isn't
what she
common
says.
anymore.
Yeah,
It really isn't.
yeah.
I mean, this generation has no problem-solving skills. They don't realize if I do this, this will happen. It's like they just do whatever they feel like doing regardless of the consequences. And if something happens they don't like, well, how'd that happen?
One day she asked us, she was like, "Where did you guys learn all this?" We're like, "From our parents and like life." Yeah.
Yeah.
Life is funny.
Yeah. So that's an important aspect that I think is missing from much of the church today. And the verse 4 there is kind of interesting as well, is that another responsibility of older women in the church is to teach the younger women to be sober and to love their husbands
and their children.
Now that seemed a little bit odd to me. Does that seem odd to anybody else? That would be there?
Be sober.
Was the sober the part you thought was odd?
Well, no, I thought actually. I thought, you know, I mean that's a given, but you would have to teach a woman to love her husband and children. That seems odd to me.
They also had like courting as well, though.
No,
No.
talking to husband and children. It seems to me that would be a natural
Within,
thing, right?
but we
Yeah.
see within the community, within the world in that day, they had their own version of women's liberation being promoted. That's
Tell-
why
tell
Paul
me
had to
more.
address the issue of the head covering and how they
Jewelry
adorned
and
themselves and all that, because that world view of women asserting themselves and being independent was already making its headway there.
I tell you,
It was creating problems.
King Ahasuerus knew how to nip that in the bud.
But I'm just saying,
Bye, Vashti.
a woman though, a woman that has, of course, a husband, you would think that, you know, there's love there automatically. You wouldn't have to have your mom say, no, you need to love your husband. And then, of course, when the kids come along, the children come along, I mean, she has carried this child. They have a bond and whatnot. Just inherently, they have this bond. You wouldn't think that the mother would have to say, no, you need to take care of that child and love that child. I mean, I know there's some freaks out there that would off their kids if they had the chance, but it seems like most women, by far, would have a natural love and care for, especially the children.
Could also be talking about getting advice from other people.
How to parent.
Yeah, because it could
I'm
be
just
something
looking at
as
what the
simple as
words
like,
say.
I don't
Okay,
know.
think about this for a second though. We're talking to a letter written to the
Admonish.
Christian church,
I mean to
but
admonish.
these people in this Christian church that Paul or Titus is writing to were not necessarily in the church all their lives. These may well have been people that came from the pagan culture. Now, what did they do in the pagan cultures when
Sacrifice their kids.
Yeah, they would take that firstborn child and offer it to their idols, which definitely is one of those mindsets that destroys the fabric of the family.
But
Because
as
if
a
you
baby,
can take your child, your
an infant.
baby,
An infant.
and offer it up to be roasted and eaten, how much love is there in a society where you have that kind of mindset? What do we see in
Yeah,
our
but
world
once you get
today?
that first one out of the way, you're home free, right? No, but I'm just saying, it just seemed odd to me. What does it mean to admonish?
Think about it for a minute, though. What's happened in our world today?
Oh, there's a gross disrespect for life in general.
Yeah, once we started saying children needed to be prevented at all costs,
Right.
and only have them if they're wanted, and then if you don't want them, here's a pill you can take or a doctor you can visit who will get rid of it for you.
Well, let me ask the proverbial question then. Did your mom have to tell you to love our children? Did she have to admonish you to love our children?
No, but part of that's because I had
Okay,
her
I rest my
example.
case.
Well, so what about this? Did you ever get advice from mom?
Yes,
about
I
how,
did.
That's what I thought this would be more related to. Would be stuff like
The
your
word
son
is-
just set the
the
rug on
word-
fire and
look
like
up the word
burn
love
down
there.
half
It's
your
probably
house.
agape.
Never mind.
I'm sorry.
Just keep going. Go ahead. Keep on talking.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, but
No, it's okay.
it's the
Keep
word
on
is
going.
love. It's not
3 strikes.
advice. It's
The
not
third time.
counseling. It's not what's the word love there?
I'm pulling it up right now.
No, you'll have a case there if it says advice and counseling and.
It's the word sophronizo.
Say that fast 3 times.
Oh, that's just to teach to be sober. Sorry.
No, I was about to
Wrong
say
word.
that doesn't make any sense.
yeah,
That's not
it's-
one of any of the
Looking
five
at the way
ones
they
or
have the
six
Strong's
right
in
now.
here.
Yeah.
Okay, to love their children, love their husband.
About to say Sophroniso sounds like
Philandros.
sophistry, huh?
Philandros. For loving her husband. It says Philandros, fond of man, affectionate as a wife, loving her husband.
Mm.
It's not agape.
Well, agape is godly love,
Right.
selfless love. But again, it just seemed odd to me that you would have to teach a woman. Now, I could understand teaching a man how to, love his wife and love the children and all that. I get that, but because he's so directed other directions. But for a woman, it just seemed inherent,
What was the verse? But in the last days, people would be unthankful, unholy, without natural affection.
Right. Lovers of pleasure rather than lovers
Right.
of God.
As you get people in this worldly mindset, I mean,
But this is
I've met
2,000 years ago.
I've met women who thought nothing of the fact that they'd had 3, 4, 5 abortions because it was inconvenient to be pregnant and have to raise a child.
Right.
We have a society that says we have a pill for that. You can take a morning after pill.
Right.
We've got this whole mindset. Number one, if we have a mindset that children are undesirable, should be prevented, can be aborted, killed shortly before they're born, and sometimes shortly thereafter with the latest laws that are being
Get on
passed,
that.
then what does that tell us about life in general? What does that mean? If these, what does it contribute to the increase in human trafficking, where there are people that have all kinds of perversions and are selling children on the black market and marketing teenagers and whatnot? Does it have anything to do with the amount of abuse that we are seeing in society today, abuse of children in other ways?
Yeah.
Hello, Mason.
You brought the mop in.
Yes, I mean, I think that's part of it too. And it's also, I think, good to note the order in which it's stated in, as well as the types of love that is distinguished between the two.
Is the love their children a different word?
Yeah,
Is it?
it is.
What's the one for love their children? Did you write that down?
I've got it right here.
Oh, okay.
It's like philotechnos.
Philotechnos?
Yeah, and the other one was
Philotechnos. That's the way they got the accent on there.
philandros.
Yeah, one's like
and
brotherly
philotechnos.
love, but they're all philo. They're all on that same root of
Love.
brotherly love.
Yeah, but there is a distinction between the two at
Yeah,
least.
there's definitely a difference between them.
And
Fond of one's children.
yeah, I'd be like, yeah,
Right.
you're all right.
Yeah, I kind of like you.
Yeah.
We'll let you stay.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's an important thing too, as well, is that the order it goes in is important also. To love their husbands and to love their children in that order.
Well, Susan had written, I think it's a tool that can be used for teaching good. I think she's talking about the internet. Sorry, I missed seeing that there was a message coming up.
Yeah, so teach the young women to be sober.
But you see that this whole thing that was wrapping up this package, the idea that the family was an important unit. You see in Scripture that God established the family, and you see this thread running through that we need to safeguard the family.
That's interesting. The King James says for them to be sober. The New King James says not given to much wine.
Yeah.
So that means you could have a little. A little. Okay. A little. As long as you stay sober.
Well, there are some who think that a little wine is a good thing and that they don't have to get drunk.
Because of the resveratrol. What is what's the?
It's the color pigment of grape juice.
Well, it's the.
Well, this particular Greek word, sober and vigilant, are translated the same word, from the same word. And it says the biblical usage is sober, temperate, abstaining from wine either entirely or at least from its immoderate use, or of things free from all wine, such as vessels and offerings. So.
Yeah, because the way I understand it to some degree is that wine was also used as medicine and like a painkiller.
Right.
You know, the Bible said to give wine to him who is dying or perishing, basically, is like a.
Well, they would do the same thing. They would try to drug up people that are being crucified.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. Is just like the understanding that this is talking about aged women in particular. You know, talking about them not being given too much wine. Like, people get older, they have aches and pains.
Right.
You know, numb the pain
Take
with a
the
little
edge
bit
off a little bit.
Yeah, take the edge off. But it's basically saying, like, if you're, if this was the way you are, you shouldn't be, because if they're going to be setting the example, they need to be those things that they're trying to teach.
Yeah, well, temperance, too, is the real key.
I think, too, that the term sober also implies not being silly. There is a tendency in our culture towards silliness. In fact, when we were talking about Facebook, how much useless, silly garbage is on there. Mm-hmm. You go and look at somebody's profile, and it's either a collection of funny pictures, funny videos, or it's a collection of 40,000 pictures of themselves in different poses and clothing and hairdos and makeup and all this other thing. We have become a society so fixated on self, and the Christian perspective is outward, not inward. So you see this emphasis here on all of it being. What are you smiling about? On all of it being outward.
I was just thinking of people who do a lot of posts where they post a picture of themselves and then there's a Bible verse. That's just what I was thinking of.
Haven't seen too much of that on Facebook. I must be.
That's because
looking
people
at
stopped
wrong
reading the
place.
Bible altogether and just posting pictures of themselves. They were like, I don't get why I'm even putting the verse in here. It may as well just be me, because that's what I want people to look at.
But the soberness, I mean, the up here in verse 2, that aged men be sober, that aged women be sober. You know, the teaching the young women to be sober, to love their husbands, to love their children. Those are all young men, be sober-minded. You know, I think that has a whole lot to do with the perspective of looking at life in general. Life
Being a
is
little
serious.
more serious, yeah.
Yeah.
Should be very serious.
Don't be
Yeah.
reckless. You know, there's this tendency, everything we've got in society right now is geared toward me first. It's all about me. If you were to look at the advertising campaigns, because I'm worth it. You deserve a break today. You know, I gotta be me. This is all about what I want, what I feel, what I think I need. And it's not about serving anybody else and what they need. And we're supposed to have a different perspective.
And it's especially not about serving your husband.
That point right there is exactly why I was saying the verse after it is like, you know, about loving your husband.
Yeah.
Like why they're teaching the young how to love their husband. That's the exact reason I was saying that might be because of like teaching, because like for actual loving your husband, it's like your husband would come like first.
Right.
So it's like teaching them those kind of things. That's why I was looking at it the example of like to teach somebody to love their kids. It's like your kid is really frustrating you, and instead of punishing them, you have an opportunity to show them grace or something, or to teach them. It's like showing them love instead of just beating them down with a punishment. Stuff like that. That's what I was talking about by like teaching how to love. That's what I think it means as well.
And you look at the list in verse 5 too, that they're supposed to teach the young women to be discreet. What's being discreet?
Modest?
I wouldn't say secretive as much as like trustworthy to some degree, like to keep quiet.
Laura needs that verse.
No, the quiet. You talk about
I
low
know.
volume.
Yeah.
No, I don't.
Discreet.
Discreet doesn't mean that. To be discreet means you don't broadcast everything you know.
Yeah.
You don't say everything.
Well, it's a sign of wisdom.
Let it all
To be
out.
reserved.
Right. You to be reserved.
Yeah.
Chaste, meaning modest in your behavior. And like I said, this was an issue in the Christian church at that time because the pagans were encouraging women to be immodest. They had their sex orgies in the temple, and so you got people that came out of that culture. For them, modesty in their dress was not natural. Modesty in their behavior wasn't natural. You know, you're dealing with a whole different circuit of people.
Yeah.
So, you know, we tend to look at it as believers, as the Bible was written to us, and we understand certain basics. But we forget that this group here, especially in the New Testament, they were getting all kinds of people coming into the church. Now, we find here, you know, the church is a microcosm of the world around us. So people come into a church bringing all of their expectations from whatever other experiences they've had. And so there is a place for teaching people how to be quiet and reserved, how to listen.
Yeah, and going along those lines, that's why I think the other two verses mean more related towards teaching, I guess, love in general to like young women and stuff. Because I don't know anybody who doesn't inherently have at least some love.
Right.
Because I've known people who are like 14 and they still love their child to death. Like they weren't taught to love their child necessarily, but it's like they inherently have that love for their kid, even though they're very
Okay,
young.
now there's something we need to define though. What is love? Is love a sentimental affection? I have this baby. I'm 14 years old. Look at this. I've dressed this baby up in its
Well,
new
that's also
clothes.
why I was saying.
I'm taking it to show off to my friends. Is that love or is that affection?
Well, that's exactly why I was saying teaching them to love.
Right.
Like they still like that child and would do a lot of things for that kid, but teaching them to actually love their children or love their husband.
And
is why-
loving their
that's
children
why I was
also
debating
means
it more
correcting
as
them when they do something wrong.
Teaching them, yeah.
I mean, I've known many parents who don't take the time to correct their children when
Holy
they're
Spirit of
wrong.
the rod hated this child.
And some that correct them way too much. There's also the element of self-sacrificing. You know, if you have a society that is so steeped in selfishness, you've got this baby that can't do anything for itself. It cries at all hours of the day and night. It's hungry when it's hungry. It's wet, it's dirty, it throws up on you. It does all these things that you don't enjoy. But once you've got that child, that's your deal. And there are a lot of parents who can't handle that around the clock responsibility. There's fatigue that goes with it. And this is where I think the older women in the church help a whole lot, if recognizing that the women are frustrated with their children.
Yeah, that's why.
There's
That's
a
exactly
teaching,
why I was bringing this out.
right? There's a teaching time that you can do.
Yeah, so I found my approval.
You found what?
I found my approval. I was looking for approval on that. I was
Oh,
like,
okay.
I was in the right
He was
path.
looking for validation.
I was looking for validation.
Oh yeah.
His dad was like, no. Like,
But you know,
There's something to this.
it really is the place where you learn self-sacrificial love is in raising a child. Because believe me, at 2 o'clock in the morning, you'd rather do anything except get up and take care of that baby that's screaming in the crib. I remember one counselor said that he was doing marriage counseling, and he said one of the first things he talked to a young couple about responsibility in marriage, and he said, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, and you wake up, and your wife is making her way to the bathroom, and she's groaning because she's sick and she's in pain. And just before she gets to the door, she loses it all over the floor. Whose job is it to clean it? He says this is where love exists.
Serve Pro, just make sure you have the Serve
Yeah.
Pro, Randy.
Serve Pro, it happened again.
But you think about this, people don't recognize those practical realities of
No,
loving
God.
someone. Your husband or wife, when they get sick, who takes care of them? You know, I know a lot of women. Was it Irma Bombeck that wrote that she felt that Congress should pass a law that a woman has more than 15 minutes to get over a 24-hour virus, because she said her husband would get sick, and he went to bed, and he was at death's door, and he called out, "Bring me some aspirin. Would you bring me a heating pad?" You know,
Moaning
and moaning and groaning when he had a
Groaning.
cold. And when she was sick with the flu and barely able to move, and he said, "Does this mean you're not going to get up and fix breakfast?" You know, these expectations that we have, learning to love.
but I also think that those two verses bring out the character of woman as well.
I do.
Because it's like, it speaks to their nurturing character. And also it speaks to the role that a woman has as well to teach love. It doesn't necessarily talk about men teaching love. And I'm sure that's important too, but it says that a woman is teaching love to her children as well too.
It also says they should be keepers at home. What does that mean?
Stay at home.
Of course, that's contrasted with that Proverbs 31 woman who's out there buying a field and taking care of everybody else.
Yeah, but she's keeping the home tidy and she's still doing everything else too, so doesn't mean you have to stay at home all the time forever.
No, yeah, and there's a lot of people who use this part of the scripture to justify that women shouldn't ever leave the house and, like, you know, should just be homebodies and not ever have
Out
a
of the
life
workplace.
outside. Yeah.
Proverbs 31 definitely takes you way past that.
This woman's everywhere. Yeah, so
She's everywhere and still keeps the home.
so keepers.
But
at
she
home.
kept the home because she had servants.
Yeah, there you go.
There you go.
Makes a difference when you've got somebody else to help with some of those chores. I mean, women in those days didn't just have the deal of sweeping and mopping floors and taking care of kids. They usually had animals to tend, gardening to tend to,
You had hours of preparing
and
food.
cooking
because
took a long time because you had to fix the food from scratch.
You had to make your own flour and
Yeah, but see now, you got all the modern conveniences, right?
Oh yeah.
Should be a whiz, right?
Get to get a
so
bunch
you're
done.
not allowed to
Right?
complain.
Oh.
Taco salad every week. Works for me.
Fresh from the garden.
Well, Paul
from
Harvey.
Walmart.
Paul Harvey did a thing years ago
Fresh
where he
meat
said
garden.
there was a study where they showed that looking at what Grandma had to live with when she had to wash her clothes with the washboard and go down to the river to wash the laundry and do those things. And he said they did a study and they found that with all these modern conveniences of the machines that do the washing and the drying and all this other stuff, better fabrics and things, he said that we spend more time in the modern age taking care of things than the previous women did. because all of those machines require maintenance and upkeep.
And also we have 10 times
And we have
more
10
things.
times the clothing and stuff to take care of.
Right.
The people in the 1920s probably had one set of clothes. In fact, I remember reading several stories where kids went to school wearing the same clothes every day in the 1920s.
Now you get
They
teased
had
for it.
they had like a set of overalls and shirt that they wore all week long to school. And they had one set of clothes for church. And then their laundry got done every week or every other week. So they washed their clothes only once a week. And in most cases they didn't take baths because they didn't have indoor plumbing. So unless they went down to the river, and that was probably a pretty risky thing to do in the middle of December, you know, you didn't have the same things that we have now. We've
Well,
come
you're
to expect
speaking more
them.
to of a agricultural urban area. I mean, not urban area, but
Rural.
a rural area.
Rural population.
In the urban areas, they probably started doing it more and more often. But if you find an older home somewhere, what's one of the things that usually is absent from older homes that you might go look at to buy?
Wiring, that's to code.
Well, not that.
High ceilings.
Closet space.
Right.
Closet
that
space.
too.
You have very little closet space.
If they'd had closets at all.
If they had them at all.
They
Yeah,
usually
it's
had a
just
chef
drawers.
robe they put their clothes
It's
in.
just the
Exactly.
drawers.
So even older homes didn't even have a closet.
Because people didn't have the amount of clothes that we have
That's
now.
because the ladies hadn't gotten into the shoe
To say,
thing,
so what
the
I'm
shoe
garnering
fetish
from all
yet.
this is that women should have less clothes and stay at home more.
Is that why women have more clothes? Because they had to laugh before. Now they have the
I
opportunity.
But
think
there's
the-
something
the
appealing
principle-
though, not to, you know, think that that's totally negative. There's something very appealing about being able to put on fresh clothing.
Oh yeah.
Something
Especially if you want to hug somebody.
Right.
Yeah, there's something so appealing about not smelling like a rotten sock.
Hey, I've been in town when some of these farmers come into the bank to make a trip to the bank, and they've clearly been out in the field
Bringing in their
working with
dirty
the
money.
cattle for days.
Yeah.
Right.
You can smell them before the door opens.
So I think that's a positive step that society has progressed to, but obviously I think all of us have abused that situation. I mean, I know I have stuff in my drawers and my closets that I haven't worn for a long time. And of course, being able to move now gives me an opportunity to get rid of half of it. You know. And I believe that almost every person could get rid of literally half of what they have and
Still have too much.
still
I
have
saw a
plenty.
great tip where they said at the beginning of the year, this was a good tip for women, maybe it works for men too. Put all of your clothes that you hang in the closet, hang them all with the hanger going the same direction. And as you wear something and put it back in the closet, turn the hanger around. And at the end of that year, all the things that are in the original direction that have not been worn for a whole year, take them and give them away. Because they're obviously not being used. And so that was a way to gauge how much that you had that you needed and how much you could get rid of. I
So
thought it was
folks,
a
you
great
learn
idea.
a lot more here than just Bible
Yeah.
understanding and insight. I mean,
Sorry.
practical things is what we're all about here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm doing that storage system now in my new room where I'm just putting clothing for the winter.
On the floor,
Yeah.
wherever.
Yeah,
If it's not on the floor, I get rid of it. 'Cause
Obviously,
obviously
you can obsess about anything, and I think
It's in the dresser. it's
clothing and fashion has become an obsession, at least in the
I
West.
just saw a
you know.
comment from Ingrid that's very pertinent. She said,
Yeah.
most of the young
Always
women I
vanishes.
work with look forward to dropping their children off at daycare and refer to their husbands as barely tolerable idiots. Their primary concern is self.
Yeah, that's kind of sad.
Many of today's young mothers are narcissists.
Yeah,
That's-
they're kind of made up China dolls, right, all the time. So,
Well, you know, when you look at how much work it is to be a mom, to take care of a child, to keep them fed, to teach them, to work with them, it is so much easier to drop them off at a daycare center and go get a job where you get a paycheck, because being a mom gives you no paycheck.
The equivalent is dropping off your
Well,
husband at Lowe's or Home
yeah,
Depot.
no literal paycheck, but
tangible
it really
reward.
gives you. It really gives you some prestige and some honor, that if understood correctly.
Oh, that's true, but I'm saying we have a society now where that paycheck became an important
more important thing.
valuation. And I know a lot of men who don't want their wives to be stay-at-home moms because they want that extra paycheck.
Right.
And everybody thinks, well, it's okay. Everybody else is doing this. The kids will be fine. The kids are not fine because they're being put in this child zoo with a bunch of other kids and one or two caregivers that barely can keep up with them. And all they learn is the basic animal behavior that the other kids do. They're not getting any role models of what an adult is like. They're just learning how to behave like all the other kids.
Yeah.
And if that's all you want out of your child's life, I guess that must be enough for some people.
You know, and I think so much of that just comes back to again the breakdown of the family model altogether.
Mhm.
True.
And you know, all the problems that we have, I think, pretty much just stem from people being unwilling to fulfill their part in what they're called to do.
And a lack of respect for Scripture. And sometimes it's also the case that you don't have a husband and wife on the same page.
Yeah.
You know, if one's a believer and one isn't, their philosophies about child raising and education
Vaccines.
and medical care and all of those things. What did you say? Vaccines? Yeah.
Oh no.
It's not quite a doctrinal issue, but it is an issue.
It's a health issue.
Yeah.
You know, those kind of things, if you are unequally yoked with someone who doesn't have those same values, you talk about a struggle that will never end. You know, I've talked to women that are just frustrated because their hearts are breaking at the thought of injecting this garbage into their babies. But they don't have a husband backing them up. They've got a husband who's saying, you got to do this. This is important.
Right.
Because they believe all the junk that's been put out there in the
Propaganda,
media.
yeah.
So it's really a hard place to be when you don't have somebody where you're really working together. When you're unequally yoked, you're definitely pulling in opposite directions in a lot of places.
Oh, sure.
And so these women that were struggling, you know, maybe some of the counsel for the older women to teach the younger women to love their husbands had to do with some of those issues. You know, if you're still married to somebody who isn't a believer, it can be pretty challenging to continue loving.
And I also think that the advice is equally as much for the young women as it is for the older women as well.
Right.
Because I think over time you become so used to people as well that if you aren't continually trying to practice something that is like that, I mean, we discussed a couple weeks ago about the idea that love like this is sacrificial in nature. And that, you know, if you aren't, you know, like if you get to an older point in your life and you don't have somebody to pass these values on to remind you
Or if
that
they're
your
just
job
always-
is still
yeah.
to love your husband and your children. Because I mean, I know a lot of people get older and they just become bitter. You know, they either hate kids or they, you know, or they don't like their husbands. You know, like I think it was Ingrid you said who left that one comment.
You know, she said they would rather drop their kids off at daycare and they
Yeah,
consider
well,
their
yeah.
husbands as idiots.
It also
Yeah.
even tells them not to drink too much wine, just like the young ones and stuff, to be sober. So I mean, it gives them the same kind of advice.
That's what I'm saying is you can't really. It's hypocritical to teach something you aren't practicing. And so the
It
implication
actually says
is,
that about the men on the line too.
the implication is that you are passing something on that you actually are doing.
It's all about values.
Yeah, like you can't teach somebody to love if you don't know how to do it yourself.
Right.
And I think a lot of that also comes with experience, and I think that's why their responsibility is to pass that down. Because then you also have that perspective, like Simeon was saying, of advice where you can say, hey, here's some things you're probably going to encounter throughout your married life, or here are things that are going to make you crazy about your kids, so just be expecting these things and know that you can push past it and you can still love your kids and your husband even when this
Plus,
happens.
there's a wealth of really practical knowledge that older women can pass along to the younger ones. You know, ways to do things that save time and save money. Those are really practical elements. I don't know how many people I know that have grown up thinking they had to have the best of everything.
Mhm.
Didn't know they could economize, that they could spend less at the grocery store, spend less in on their family's clothing, because they'd never been taught to do any of those things. The schools aren't teaching it. If you're going to learn it, you're going to learn it at home.
Mhm. Absolutely, and so the last part there is being good, which I think is very prominent, even though it's only the one word, but being good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God be not blasphemed. That's kind of an interesting point. And I think it's also important to note that
Obedient
it's
to
not...
their own husbands, huh?
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction as well, that it's not just obedient to men in general. That a wife has no obligation to listen to what any other man has to say. Her only obligation is to be obedient to her husband. And I feel like that's important because I feel like I have seen and experienced different places where it seems like men think their role is to be in control over all women everywhere.
Oh yeah.
And especially in positions of leadership like pastors and stuff like that, where they think they have some kind of right to tell women
people
what to do,
do.
and that women are supposed to follow suit because their job is to be obedient.
Susan says the older women teaching the younger is a great opportunity to show the love of God by sharing that beauty in our relationships.
Absolutely.
What for me, part of what modeled this for me, I didn't see this kind of relational stuff in my own home. But I was mentored by an older woman in the church after I came in. And Mary, when she found out that Jerry and I were planning on getting married, she called me over and did studies with me on the duties of a wife and duties of a husband from the Bible. And it was a great study series of understanding what the importance of wife and mother was. And she told me at the time, she said, society is losing this. She said, these women's libbers, as she called them, are telling women that you don't need the men. The men are worthless. That you can do it all by yourselves. And she said, you can't, and you shouldn't want to.
Just sperm donors.
Yes. And I think that it's also the women's liberation thing is a lack of respect.
Right.
And some of it was in response to a lack of respect that women were getting from the men. But, this whole concept of the unit of the home being really important because you're influencing 2 or 3 generations down the road. And when you've got a whole generation of kids being raised in daycare centers by strangers, guarantee you those strangers are not going to love your kids. They're not going to teach them any good values. And so what are you going to have? Kids that are going to grow up and they're going to raise those same kind of things,
My mom put me in daycare, so I have no idea what raising a kid at this age is like anyways.
Yeah.
So.
James Dobbs said there was a study done years ago where they asked parents, how much time every day do you believe you spend talking with your child, interacting with them? And, they got different figures from different people. The men thought they spent, 15 minutes to an hour, and that the women were spending several hours. And they wired these kids up with microphones so that they could measure how much time and interaction they got. And it was like a minuscule fraction of what all of the parents believed they were spending with their kids. With the men, who thought they spent up to an hour, it was less than 5 minutes of actual interaction, talking, and very little of that was eye contact. And he said it was one of the most interesting studies because, most of it is yelling from the other room, stop that, whatever you're doing, cut that out. There is a tendency as parents to do that, and we can get to the end of the day and have been so busy, we haven't looked our kids in the eye and talked to them. We haven't given them any message that they matter to us, that we love them, that they're important to us. But that's different from the helicopter parents that think their kids are so important that nothing unpleasant should ever happen to them. There's a balance.
We spend too much time talking.
Is Titus also, because I'm getting the impression that Titus is written for the church, or to church people.
It is.
Yeah, okay, because
this
is also assuming that the husband is already holy and already a religious man. Because when it talks about being obedient to the man, it's that the word of God be not blasphemed.
Right.
That's the other part of that. That's the other half of being obedient to the man, is that they're obedient to the man because he's a godly man.
Or that,
not just because he's your husband.
Or that the respect, even if there wasn't great affection, and even if he was undeserving. If you remember the case of Abigail in the story of David,
no,
she was married to a man named Nabal, his name means fool, and it was customary for the landholders, if someone had taken care of their flocks or whatever, they would provide them with food. Mm-hmm. And David and his men had protected Nabal's flocks from harm from some marauding bandits or whatever. And when they came and asked for some food, he sent them away and said, no way, get out of here.
And she went out.
And when she found out about it, she gathered up her servants and she got food and she took it out to meet them. And she told them, please, because she knew that they were going to be mad and they had every legal right to come and kill him. And they were getting ready to do just that. And she came out by night and brought them food and asked them not to do this. That, she said, he's kind of, as his name says, he's a fool. And don't do this to him. She showed reverence and respect for her husband, who was totally undeserving of it.
Well, that's the thing, though. She wasn't obedient to her husband.
Well, he didn't tell her she couldn't do it.
No, but that's what I'm saying.
he
He wasn't. He wasn't.
He didn't know she
necessarily-
did that, but she knew she needed to protect his life.
Yeah.
Even though, to all outward
Even though he
appearances,
didn't.
his life
What?
wasn't worth protecting at that point.
What's I'm saying? I'm getting the impression he wasn't a godly man.
I don't think he was.
But that's the thing, though. I'm
In
saying
fact,
like
when he
this.
found out what she had done, he had a stroke and died. He got so angry, he had a stroke and died shortly
Because
thereafter.
that's convenient, because then David married her. So
She became queen.
that would need to happen if he was going to do that.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. Like this relates. The obedience to your husband also really, I think, relates a lot to godliness. Because it's not like a man has like the authority. Because what if a man's like abusive to his wife and you have to just be obedient to not tell anybody?
No, obedience doesn't mean not telling anybody.
Well, if he's like, don't tell anybody, then you have to be obedient because then it'd be obligation. But that's what I'm saying. I think it's more related to religious men because it's like you should be obedient because the religious man is religious because he's righteous.
Okay. Well, what happens when
To a
you're
godly
when you're
man.
in a marriage where you have a godly spouse, and over time they lose that relationship with the Lord and walk away from it?
Then why would you need to be obedient to your husband if he's telling you to be not righteous? Where's your obligation to be
Well, it's
obedient
not
to
just
your husband?
obedient in the sense of doing what he's telling you to do. If he's telling
I know
you to-
that. That's
Your first obligation is to obey God.
Yeah. Of course.
But
Well,
looking
that's
at,
exactly the parallel I was
but
kind of
looking
making.
at looking at this issue of respect. I mean, respect is an even greater issue of love than obedience. We use this term obedience, which is thrown around as like a master servant type thing. But it really boils down to respect, and you still need to have respect. You still need to have respect
Well,
for
that's what
your
I was saying. I wasn't
ungodly
saying
parents.
I was saying that it's not like a master servant thing. I was just saying that the obedience is like a righteous man telling his wife something, doing something like giving advice to be like something like I don't know, so an example of something religious that she's doing and she's not doing something religious, and he brings it to her attention. She would be obedient in trying to actually look at that and trying to change that.
Right.
That's what I mean by like obedience. I don't mean like just because he's a righteous man, he's like do the dishes.
Obeyeth thou me, woman.
That's why women's feet are shorter than men's. So they can get closer to the sink and the stove.
That's funny. Yeah. So I mean, so there's much to it, and I think another part of that issue deals with both sides having a difficulty with a willingness to accept their role
Yeah.
and their responsibility. For men, it's the idea of sacrifice. We don't have any problem taking charge and giving orders. I think it's the idea of being a self-sacrificing person for the person you love, for your family. I think that's the hard part for men, and for women, it's to choose to be subordinate to the husband. And I think there is even scripture that addresses the idea of servants and people being subordinate to people who are somewhat oppressive, to the best of their abilities. I'm sure there's exclusions to that, but I think it deals with a greater blessing from God in terms of, I think it says something to the effect of like, a greater blessing if you can endure hardness, and that's usually pertaining to servants. I don't know if it's specific to wives, but there's an aspect to
And
that.
there's also an element of men having to put up with wives that are
Abusive.
unpleasant.
Yeah, but I think that's the hard part, is that it really just takes someone on either side of that relationship to take the first step towards their role. And I think that's the hardest part, is it's an individualized choice that has to happen for each side of the couple for a relationship, for a marriage to take place the way it's supposed to. And if one or more of them isn't doing that, then it's hard. It's so funny.
She sends me side comments on Facebook. And she sent me Or she says I have shoe size 9.
Size 9.
I love her sense of humor.
Yeah.
She didn't post it on the chat. She sent it to me as a separate message.
Okay. Gotcha.
I'm sorry, you make me laugh, Susan. You're gonna get caught.
Alright, cool. Well, I guess we will end for the day and see where we go from there. And next week we can pick it back up and talk more about that, or
I hope I didn't derail your
Kids.
plans for today too.
no, that's fine. Like I said, so like this is what we did last week,
Oh, okay.
and so the rest of that is like stuff we could unpack as well. And I just
Great.
forgot that I'd written that out, so I went ahead and moved on to other parts of the studies. So
We're good. We
So
got
we-
enough to go for a while then.
we've got some material. Cool. So we'll go ahead and have prayer then, and do the fun part and eat some physical food.
This was a fun part.
No,
I enjoyed
they're
this.
both fun. They're both fun. All right. Father, we thank you so much for the Sabbath. We thank you for family and for all these things that you've left for us to study and to understand. We know that over the years we have distorted our views of love and relationships and even the roles that we each have as husband and wife and man and woman. We just ask that as we continue these studies, you would give us more understanding, and that above all you would give us a conviction to be more like the roles that you have defined for us, because we know that they are perfect for us. And the main thing we ask is that you would make us more like your Son. Help us to conform to your will and to be more like you in every way that we can. And we ask for the rest of the Sabbath that you would give us rest and help us to reflect more on you and to enjoy the food that's been prepared as we eat together as a family. We bless those who've watched online as well, and we hope that they've enjoyed the spiritual food that we've all gotten to enjoy together and the discussions, and we just look forward to seeing where it goes in the future. So thank you, we praise you, and we ask these things in the name of your Son. Amen.
Oh, Ingrid posted a comment here. When my oldest child was 6 weeks, per societal standard, I begrudgingly returned to work. By lunch that day, I quit my job and picked up my baby. My husband was not pleased, so as a compromise, I went to work in a daycare. That way I could contribute to the household financially and keep my baby with me. I was surprised to learn the daycare workers didn't care about the babies. They frequently ignored their cries, called them names, and of course made sure they were clean and fed at pickup time.
She always brings out some interesting insight.
She does.
Thank you, Ingrid.
And maybe we ought to start a daycare that actually has love as an emphasis.
Well, that's what you're finding, that a lot of churches are doing just that too,
Yeah.
because they
Ministry.
see that there is a need for Christian daycare, that parents really want their kids to have
To
something
be
with
loved while
values.
they're away.
Yeah.
Hey, would you love my child for me while I'm gone? Thanks.
Well, anyway, thanks for joining us again today. Glad to have you along. Hope to see you again next week. Until then, have a wonderful Sabbath and have a blessed